I'm Yaz Gagne.
I'm Josh Christensen.
And this is Most Innovative Companies Video Edition. So, Josh, what is a business that you miss that got ruined by private equity?
I think I have to be just a cringy millennial and say Toys R Us. It was such a huge part of all of our childhoods. That's probably one of the most famous examples of
Totally.
Of
That's the one everybody
takeover.
Kind of points to.
Yeah. It was a great store. It had a Ferris wheel in it. It was ridiculous.
But I didn't know about the Ferris wheel.
Oh, you never had one of those stores? It wasn't in all stores. I think that kind of changed. But there was definitely one that was like...
It was in the Providence store.
The Warwick, the Rhode Island Mall adjacent store, which is, speaking of other, entities that are out of vogue, the Rhode Island Mall no longer exists. It got shut down, and now it's just a ghost town in there. I'm going to blame private equity for that, too. Big problem. But, rest in peace, Toys R Us, and to a lesser extent, Babies R Us. What about you? What makes you sad about private equity?
I think the private equity roll-up of a lot of local newspapers or regional newspapers has made me really sad. We've seen job cuts throughout. We've seen a lot less local reporting on issues that are really important and that wouldn't get reported on by national newspapers. So I don't think there's like a super sustainable model for it, but it's definitely, something that I think affects like society as a whole.
Yeah, that's really a shame. I think we're going to get into it in your upcoming interview, but there used to be multiple local newspapers in almost every major city, and now you're lucky to have one, if any. And that's really sad.
Half of it is like clickbait,
Half of it's clickbait. Some of it was really good reporting, but also like pour one out for like the most ridiculous human interest piece that were done by local newspapers. It was awesome. So
the pet section.
The pet section was great. Just where there was an industry made out of just saying someone got married in your town.
Yep.
Awesome. Love everything about that. I think we should also apply a little bit of blame to Craigslist, though.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Although Craig Newmark sponsored your alma mater.
Yeah, I went to the Craigslist J School, which is wild. I think he gave $20 million to the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, and now it's named the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. So he's making a little bit of amends. He also gives a lot of money to like Poynter and a bunch of other places. So Craig's doing okay, but Classifieds really kind of got the whole business model. He probably
never even thought of that when he started Craigslist, because he would have picked a less silly name. Anyway.
He probably would have.
It's like, my name's Craig.
If I was gonna kill an entire industry of local media, I wouldn't put my first name on it.
That's so funny. So the reason we're talking about this is because private equity has ruined so many more businesses than you realize, and also runs so many more businesses than you might realize. Few of us realize how pervasive it is in our lives. Remember Toys R Us, which Josh just mentioned? A victim of private equity. Has your healthcare system gotten worse? Also possibly due to private equity. So in her book, Bad Company, Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream, Megan Greenwell explores all of this, profiling 4 workers who have been affected by private equity, infiltrating their workplace in different ways. So I spoke to Greenwell about how private equity can bleed businesses dry and how the industry evades scrutiny. Now here's our interview. I should say, not all private equity deals are bad. We're mostly talking about the bad ones here.
As a reminder, this is an extended cut of this interview that you can only see on Fast Company's YouTube page. But we do have a bunch more content in the audio version of this podcast that you can get on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, or wherever you listen. And before you go over there, remember to subscribe to Fast Company's YouTube page. You can click right down below.
And now, my interview with Megan Greenwell. I think it was Bloomberg that had a private equity person review your book. And
yes,
we'll get to why you chose to write the book and your story around that. But I guess I wanted to start with that and hear how you feel about the whole situation.
I mean, I was not offended. I did not expect a private equity executive to like my book. Frankly, no, I did not expect a private equity executive to review my book either.
I did think, I'll be honest, the concept, kind of a stroke of genius. I'm not...
I mean, yes. If it was like deliberately trolling, I'm super into it, frankly. Yeah, it was, it was very funny because I knew Bloomberg was reviewing it, and I had gotten other reviews before that, which were like lovely and positive and whatever. And I woke up and it was like, there's a review in Bloomberg. And I had been sort of nervous about like what a Bloomberg review would say, because I am like not like, originally I am not a business journalist. This was my first like big
and we'll get into that,
project.
right? Yeah.
And so I was sort of like, oh no, like they're going to have some like, very seasoned business journalists like find problems with my book. And instead it was a private equity executive who literally says in the review, I'm not the target audience for the book, but here are all the reasons it offended me. So I was like, okay, great. I mean,
like you could be the target audience for the book if you like took something from it, but sure.
If you had some curiosity, maybe, yes. But it was, like the advice you get is like, don't give any oxygen to bad press. But I was like, I'm sorry. Like, I just can't resist posting this on the internet. And I posted it with like my affiliate link to Blue Sky. And I got to tell you, Gary, the private equity executive, moved so many copies for me. Like the guy from the Mountain Goats tweeted about it.
That's so funny.
It was a whole thing. So, I mean, all press is good press.
And I'm sorry for then giving it more oxygen by asking you about it, but it sounds like it's moved, it's sold some units, so I don't feel too bad.
Totally. All's well that ends well.
So you first got interested in the world of private equity and writing about private equity after your time at Deadspin. Tell us, for those who don't know, tell us a little bit about that whole situation and what got you interested in writing the book.
Yeah. When I got to Deadspin, I mean, that was like my dream job. Like, I did not want any other jobs. I had been a Deadspin reader for so long. And so when they hired me as their editor-in-chief, I was like, great, I will stay as long as they will have me. And I knew the company was potentially for sale when I started. But frankly, I thought that was a good thing because we were owned by Univision at the time. And Univision was like, not paying any attention to our business side.
So you were like, someone's going to come in and give us a bunch of money and we'll be able to do the journalism we've always wanted to do.
Well, and figure out how to make more money, right? We were profitable, but they weren't like trying very hard. It was 2019 and we didn't have a subscription model, like basic stuff where I was like, yes, I would love some business geniuses to come in here, right?
And this was a time, I think, there was a lot of optimism around, Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post, around,
totally.
Mark Benioff owning Time Magazine. Like, there was a moment in media where people thought, there's a lot of investment coming in. People care about what we do.
Yes. No, it felt exciting. And it all fell apart really quickly. I mean, honestly, within the first week, I was going, oh no, this is going to be an absolute disaster because they just neither understood what we did nor had any curiosity about what we did. So they came in saying, like, you need to cut these kinds of content. And I would say, very genuinely, you would think that, but actually the data show that those types of content overperform. So we certainly wouldn't want to cut those because, why would we want to tank our traffic? And they would be like, no, we told you to cut it. And so it just felt sort of baffling to me that they were not making the decisions that were in the best interest of the business. And so I got driven out of my job within about 3 months of the acquisition. The rest of the Deadspin staff followed me out the door maybe 2 months after that. And, I had written an essay on my last day at Deadspin that went sort of disturbingly viral called The Adults in the Room, that was just about my experience working for these guys. And a lot of people said like, oh, you should write a book about this. But I am not a personal writer. Like, I'm a reporter. And so that was not super interesting to me. And I didn't want to write a book about media, frankly.
You want people really to be interested in it. Yeah.
Yes, I want people to pay $30 for it. So I just like couldn't stop reading about how private equity works because I knew very little about it going in. And it was probably 6 months of reading before I finally decided, I think there is a book here. It's just very different than one talking about my own experience.
And you've, told the story of basically 4 people whose lives and their jobs were affected by private equity investment. Tell me about how you picked that format, why that was appealing to you.
The structure of the book was the very first thing I came up with. I knew I wanted to tell the story through individual people and, sort of follow that narrative nonfiction tradition. And I knew that I wanted to separate it chronologically into like before the private equity acquisition, during the fallout, and then whatever came afterward. So that was the easy part. Finding the specific characters was so hard. I talked to over 300 people for the book, and I think close to 150 of them were potential protagonists because I just needed people who were going to open their entire lives to me and let me follow them for 2 years. And most people don't want to do that. I wouldn't want to do that. And I just happened to find these 4 people who are incredibly open and also just incredibly compelling characters. Like they're complicated and flawed, but also just super introspective and smart and interesting. One's a Toys R Us retail worker who worked in Oregon. One's a doctor in rural Wyoming. One's a local newspaper journalist who worked in Texas and Indiana. And one is a tenant of a large private equity owned apartment complex in Northern Virginia. And they were just like, yeah, what do you want to know? I'll tell you everything. And so I really felt lucky that I found the right people.
As you were looking for them, did you start with the industries or did you kind of start with the people and then consider their industries later? Because I think, to my mind, Toys R Us is like one of the big private equity acquisition examples that people point to constantly in business journalism,
Yes.
Right?
I knew from the very beginning that I wanted to do somebody from Toys R Us specifically because it felt hard to tell the story of like 2010s and 2020s private equity without telling the Toys R Us story. So I always knew that I wanted to start there because you can see so much of the playbook for what came later being written in that Toys R Us deal. And then the rest, I probably had 5 industries in mind for the 3 spots. So it was a little bit of a combination of looking for the right industry and looking for the right people. The ones I ended up with, healthcare, media, and housing, felt like the right one because they did sort of show an evolution of private equity. And so they felt really representative and like they were doing different things. One risk was like just telling the same story over and over again with slightly different facts. And these felt different enough. Like healthcare, you can see private equity really came into healthcare after the Affordable Care Act.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see the ways in which private equity getting into healthcare learned from private equity in retail and applied the exact same tactics. So that was really interesting to me because it almost didn't matter whether it was a chain toy store or a hospital. They were just widgets in the same factory.
In the intro to the book, you talked about, and Toys R Us is obviously the perfect example of this, the fact that, in private equity, these firms take on a lot of debt to acquire a company. That debt is then passed on to the company, right? What, just in the beginning, as you started reporting this, what were the most surprising things about the private equity industry that you saw that you really wanted to get to readers?
The first thing I learned that really burrowed into my brain and wouldn't leave me alone was that 10 times as many companies owned by private equity enter bankruptcy proceedings as other types of companies. So if you are owned by private equity, there is just automatically a 20% chance your company will go bankrupt. That was that was really stunning to me because, I was under the impression that this system worked, right? That it was like maybe a little ruthless sometimes.
Or that working meant the business doing well. You know what I mean? Because the system works in some sense, but...
Exactly. Yes, exactly. That I was under the assumption that the way to succeed if you are like a parent firm in a free market capitalist society was to make the companies you own successful, right? I was much more familiar with how VC works than private equity. And that is how VC works, right? You're unicorn hunting. You have to go looking, you hit a lot of base hits and then you occasionally get like a big home run and get Uber or whatever. So that was what I thought worked. And I became really obsessed with the question of how can you have a system in what is supposedly like this perfectly functioning capitalist economy where you don't even have to make your own portfolio companies successful. You have this total split in incentives where sometimes what is good for you as the firm is literally harming the company you are tasked with saving. So that was really the first thing that I was just like, wait, what? What is happening here?
I think the other thing that struck me as I was reading, obviously being a business reporter, I know some private equity firms, but it's not like they don't have the ubiquity of like the name Goldman Sachs will conjure feelings in people automatically. But I remember, I think maybe it was in the real estate one, you talked about a group called CM Management, and like that could be anything. You know what I mean? Like we don't
totally. Yes.
We basically don't understand how much private equity interacts with our lives because we cannot even put a name on these firms. Is that fair to say?
Oh, I think it's completely fair. One experience I had again and again was talking to workers who, until everything blew up, had zero idea that their employer was owned by private equity, right? Because why would you? To take my Toys R Us character as an example, her paycheck said Toys R Us. Her bosses, like 7 or 8 levels above her, all worked for Toys R Us. The idea that she had some responsibility to dig into the ultimate financial health of the company and the fact that they had $5 billion in debt because they had been acquired by private equity firms is just like not realistic, right? And so I do think the industry works very secretively by design. They don't really want you to know who they are. They don't want to get attention. I mean, one experience I had over and over and over was going to communications folks at private equity firms and them just not even responding ever to detailed list of questions, requests for interviews, all of it. I just think this is a group of people who don't want any attention because attention brings scrutiny. And yet, these are some of the most prolific philanthropists in our society, right? Stephen Schwartzman, who runs Blackstone. Blackstone is the largest landlord in the world by number of units. Mm-hmm. They are incredibly powerful. They're also the biggest private equity firm in the world. And Stephen Schwartzman's name is on the central branch of the New York Public Library.
He owns the Mets, yeah.
Yeah. He's just like an unbelievably powerful figure in our society. But I think like if you asked knowledgeable people going into the New York Public Library, who is Stephen Schwartzman, who is the person that this building is named after, they would have no idea, right? And that is very different than other kinds of businessmen. Sorry, one quick correction. He doesn't own the Mets. That's Steve Cohen,
oh my
but
God,
also private
no,
equity.
I totally got them mixed up, and I feel terrible about that.
Yeah, I mean, listen, very easy to do. I just didn't want you to get like a flood of like emails.
No.
Like,
I am glad you corrected me on that. Schwartzman does the Schwartzman scholarships. Cohen does the Mets.
Yes,
that is. I got them totally.
Yes, exactly. And his daughter is like a book publisher.
Amazing.
Yes.
Must be nice. It must be nice to not have to make money.
Yes, exactly.
As you, something that you point out in the book is also, the amount of lobbying these firms do and the amount that they are entangled in our financial system. So you talked about, the sort of relationship between, I think it's Fannie Mae and, so much private equity owned real estate. And I guess I'm curious, do you think there's a world where it's possible to disentangle private equity from our financial system at this point?
Not without entirely recreating our financial system from the ground up, which is, probably a thing that is not likely to happen. That said, I think there are like a lot of changes that could be made. I'm not an activist, so I'm like very wary of prescribing solutions, but I do think, I could have written a whole separate book about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The history of those companies is so interesting to me. And, they were very specifically designed after the Great Depression to help ordinary Americans buy homes. Private equity firms just looked at that and said, like, well, there's nothing stopping us from getting Fannie and Freddie loans as well, even though that was so clearly not the point. There was nothing literally stopping them because nobody had thought of it before. And there is a world in which you could just say Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac do not give loans to corporations anymore. That's just a thing we're not interested in doing. That would be, that would not threaten the existence of the private equity industry, right? That is not like regulating them out of business. That is just saying, like, here is a source of cheap money that was designed for normal people that you're not a normal person, so you don't get to access it. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it would make sense to regulate private equity out of existence at this moment, nor do I think there's any world in which we fundamentally transform the American economy right now. But that said, I do think there are a lot of things that would make a difference.
You actually also mention in a couple of your stories nonprofits that can kind of be a buffering force against private equity. How do you think about that?
I'm really interested. So I wrote a lot about nonprofit local news startups in the media section of the book. And part of the reason that was interesting to me was in none of these industries did private equity create the root problems.
Yeah.
Right? So to take media as an example, media had a very broken business model well before private equity came into the picture. And I do think it's really important to sort of be precise with the critiques I am making against the private equity industry, because it is very easy for them to say, look, you're just blaming us for all of the problems in the economy, and we didn't create those.
Yeah, and Toys R Us was already struggling because of Walmart's business model, because of their bad deal with Amazon. Correct. Yeah.
Yes. So they did not create the root problems. They also come in not really trying to solve the root problems, because that is hard, slow work, and they're looking for a quick buck. But some of the last section of the book is, while not prescriptive, very forward-looking. And each of my four protagonists is fighting back in some sort of way. And the media section was so interesting to me because when I was looking at local news nonprofit startups, these are companies that are trying to reinvent the industry from the ground up. So they're not going after private equity. They're saying it is on us to build a healthier business model, and they're doing the work, which, I feel like even if you're a private equity firm, you should celebrate that, right? It's like the innovation that private equity firms say they're doing when they take over a company, but really are not.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. This may be a stupid way of putting it, but, I think there are some private equity successes out there. Is that fair to say?
Oh, totally.
And can you talk,
yes.
Is there an example that you sort of kept coming to again and again and being like, oh, this is how a private equity model can work?
So the private equity industry started in the 60s with what they called bootstrap deals, where essentially pumping money into small family-owned companies that showed the potential for expansion but didn't have the capital they needed to do it. That seems like
fine,
a totally inoffensive model, right? Like, great, good, wonderful. And the private equity industry's main lobbying group loves to point out that the majority of private equity deals are still in small family-owned companies. And so, yeah, I have certainly had people say to me, well, why didn't you focus on any of the success stories? And to me, the answer is the fact that it's the majority of deals is very, very different than it being the majority of money or the majority of people affected, right? There are plenty of success stories in small family-owned businesses, but small family-owned businesses are like not in a serious way what is like the driver of our economy, unfortunately. So I had a long, very in-depth conversation with Pete Stavros from KKR, who was the only private equity executive willing to talk to me on the record. And he was so smart and thoughtful, and he can point out plenty of success stories. He also started a nonprofit where KKR and other firms commit to giving employees a small ownership stake when they buy the company. And so he loves to talk about this one garage door manufacturer in Illinois where all of the employees got an ownership stake. KKR pumped a bunch of money into the company, sold it for quite a nice profit, and all of a sudden, all of these truck drivers and factory workers were getting, mid six-figure payouts. That is like unequivocally wonderful. And we're also talking about a couple of hundred people. KKR was also one of the two firms, private equity firms, involved in the Toys R Us deal, where they laid off 33,000 workers without the severance that was guaranteed in their contracts. So it's not that there are no success stories, it's that there is a disproportionate impact from the bigger ones, and the bigger ones tend to be the ones that go the worst.
And as you mentioned, the incentive structure is such that, like, when there is a success story, that's great, but firms will make money either way. And I think that's sort of the bigger message in the book.
Yeah, exactly. Right. The success stories are like almost beyond the point for private equity, except as marketing, right? Obviously, you would prefer a successful exit because that means more money. But if you can make money, even if the company literally liquidates, your need to improve the company just isn't really there. This was one thing that really got under my skin, is that private equity firms love to position themselves as sort of the swashbuckling heroes who swoop in to save companies. But because they're not responsible for the debt that they take out in companies' names, they quite literally do not have anything on the line. Only the portfolio companies and their workers stand to lose out.
What you settle in 4 industries, you settle in 4 people. What are the industries you would have loved to cover, or were there any stories you can talk about that didn't make it into the book?
I thought really seriously about writing about nursing homes. I sort of had to choose
that industry
between
is
nursing
crazy.
homes and yeah. And right. And that's another one where it's like private equity sure didn't create those problems, right? That is like a disturbingly broken industry where the more you read about it, the more committed you feel to like never letting anybody you love ever end up in a nursing home. And because so many people end up seeking out a nursing home when they have some feeling of desperation, that has made it a really attractive target for private equity. So I thought really seriously about including that, and there have been some real horror stories in nursing homes after private equity acquisitions. I ultimately just felt like hospitals were even more crucial as a story. I started reporting on a hospital in Philadelphia called Hahnemann Hospital that was a teaching hospital and a safety net hospital, right in downtown Philadelphia, had been there for certainly over 100 years. This big, grand building, and was the kind of hospital that would serve anybody who walked in off of the street. And it got taken over by a private equity firm, and they closed it within like 6 months, something like that. And it was kind of a crazy story, in part because Hahnemann had medical residents, and the number of slots for medical residents is tightly controlled by a national board. You can't just like add more residency slots. So the hospital is about to go under. They have all these residency slots, and they think, okay, we're going to sell the residency slots because these are super valuable because, they're a limited resource. And the national organization governing residency was caught flat-footed because they were sort of like, I don't think you can sell residency slots. Can you sell residency slots? Nobody's ever tried before. So that story was really fascinating to me. I ended up focusing on rural hospitals instead, and there was a really good New Yorker story about Hahnemann in particular, which helped make me turn away. But I think there's an entire book about the history of Hahnemann because it's so fascinating, and its death was really, really traumatizing for a lot of people. And the building is still sitting there empty, but everybody assumes they're working to turn it into luxury condos.
Of course.
I mean, right? It's prime downtown real estate, baby.
I'm curious, after people read this book, and this is our last question, what are the biggest lessons or, facts that you hope they really take from this?
I have heard from people over and over that, they think this is an important topic, but fortunately, private equity isn't in their lives. Maybe you work.
Your coffee shop could be private equity owned. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is the thing. I think a lot of people think like, okay, I own my own home, right? So private equity is not my landlord. And I work for the kind of company that will never be taken over by private equity, or I work for myself, right? The idea that private equity is not in your life because it doesn't literally own your employer is unfortunately just very naive. And I don't blame people for that. But one thing I hope people do, and I've already gotten very nice emails from a few people who have done this, is like, poke around. Just figure out how private equity is involved in your life. Do they own your dentist? Do they own your kids' preschool? Do they manage the toll roads in your community or manage the municipal water system? The number of ways private equity can be involved in your life is so huge and getting bigger every day. And so I just think it's a problem that they've been so successful in keeping people from knowing that. And I just want people to feel like they have the tools to know, right? There are all sorts of interesting ways to look up who owns, any given thing. I'll take hospitals as an example. There's a group called the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, and they have a hospital tracker, and you can look up any hospital in the entire country and figure out who owns it. And I just think that's cool, right? And I want more people to know that. What you do with that information is very much up to you. But if you don't have the knowledge, you can't make informed decisions. And, you learn in high school economics, right? That the reason free market capitalism works is because workers and bosses have equal information. And so that gives them power over each other. I think private equity, as it is currently constructed, is actually a corruption of free market capitalism because the workers, the communities do not have the information. And so I guess the main thing I really hope to inspire in readers is A, falling in love with these characters, but B, feeling inspired by these characters to be able to poke around and figure out what's going on in the institutions they rely on.
Well, this was great, Emma. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.